Hello and welcome to India's World. Beijing has warned Washington that its dangerous and provocative acts in the South China Sea could lead to a minor incident that sparks war. The warning came from China's Navy Chief, Admiral Wu Shengli, after a US guided missile destroyer sailed within 12 nautical miles of an artificial island created and claimed by China. This artificial island is near the Spratly Islands chain in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a strategic waterway through which about a third of all the world's traded oil passes. China insists it has sovereign rights to nearly all of the South China Sea, while its neighbors dispute this claim. Meanwhile, Beijing is also upset that an international tribunal ruled last week that it had the power to hear a case brought before it by the Philippines over its territorial row with China in the South China Sea. China has refused to participate in the proceedings, claiming that the tribunal had no role in issues of sovereignty. To discuss the heightened tensions and the US-China face-off in the South China Sea, we have with us three distinguished experts. We have with us Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. He's a former Foreign Secretary of India, formidable diplomat. He's been India's ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France and Russia. We have with us Professor Srikant Kondapalli. He's Professor of Chinese Studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And we have with us Ambassador M.K. Bhadrakumar, a well-known commentator on India's foreign policy. He was India's ambassador to Turkey and Uzbekistan. His diplomatic assignments included the Soviet Union, South Korea, Sri Lanka, Germany, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Kuwait. So I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let me begin with you. Does the US take a position on the territorial disputes in the South China Sea? And if it does not, why did it think it prudent to send a guided missile destroyer, that USS Lassen, to 12 nautical miles of an island claimed by China?
Well, it doesn't take a position on the legal part of the disputes between the various countries in the South China Sea. That it leaves to the parties to decide. But in terms of international law and the right of passage, free passage, freedom of navigation and all that, they have a clear position. And they don't recognize that these artificial islands that China has built are entitled to a 12-mile nautical zone. According to them, this is contrary to the UNCLOS, because only those islands which in high tide are above water can be considered proper islands. Yep. But this particular case is of one of where at high tide it is submerged by water and therefore is not recognized. So the Americans have wanted to assert this right of freedom of innocent passage in South China Sea, adjacent to these artificial islands, and this is what they have done.
Now, this business of whether 12 nautical miles territorial water supply to these artificial islands or not should have been a settled question, because out of the three islands created, at least two, Subi and Mischief reefs, was submerged at high tide. But the third one, the Fiery Cross Reef, a sandbar is visible actually at high tide. So are the Americans right in saying that the 12 nautical miles thing does not apply to these islands?
Well, in terms of the UNCLOS, there are two provisions which...
That's UN Law of the Sea.
The United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. There is the provision regarding the extension of the EEZs from the coastal region or from the islands, whichever the case is. In the case of China, China has been using this in a flexible manner. For instance, in the Yellow Sea, it is from the continental shelf they claim the EEZs, exclusive economic zone. But in the South China Sea, on the contrary, they use the island as the basis for measuring the EEZs. And these islands also kept changing in a flexible manner because in the 9-dashed line, which was only given last year to the United Nations Secretary General, the Chinese position on the 9-dashed line. This is also kind of flexible.
What is the 9-dashed line?
9-dashed line claims about 80% of the South China Sea as that of China's sovereignty. Yeah. They have drawn up a kind of sketch on the South China Sea region, and they claim 80% of these whole territory. Now, since the Chinese claim is also kind of flexible in this, number one, they started saying it is a historical rather than legal kind of sovereignty. Secondly, they were not very prominent in the earlier period to ascertain their sovereignty, partly because they were continental focused before. But from the 70s, they started looking at this region. And so the Chinese position had a lot of inconsistencies on this count.
Okay. Mr. Bhadrakumar, is China the only country that's claiming reefs and islands in the disputed Spratly Islands chain? Because there are other countries. China is a Johnny come lately to the business. You know, they started making their claims only in 1980. Before that, Taiwan claimed an island, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia. All of them have built airstrips there, except for Vietnam. All the other airstrips are capable of, allowing cargo planes to land, bomber jets to land, fighter jets to land. Vietnam doesn't, and surveillance planes to land. Vietnam fighter jets can't, bomber jets can't land. So all of them have built airstrips. Now China has also done that. So why is the US objecting only to what China is doing and not to others?
But this is the crux of the matter. You know, the interesting part is the United States says that it is, acting in terms of international law and all that. But US has not ratified the UN law of the sea. Unlike most of the world have, but United States hasn't. So it's not even a signatory. It's a signatory, but it hasn't ratified. Like CTBT and other things. I think essentially, therefore, we need to understand that at a certain point in history, when there are aspiring powers coming up and entrenched established powers reluctant to abdicate, frictions arise. And we are at such an inflection point in modern history and modern politics. So what has happened here, I see it as a power play. And what are the templates there? I think there are 3-4 templates which are very easy to distinguish. One is primarily on a regional scale. There is a visit by President Xi Jinping to US, which has been very productive. There are differences, but extremely productive, particularly from the economic point of view, tens of billions of dollars. So there is naturally an apprehension as to the cutting edge of the rebalance strategy in Asia in the minds of the Southeast Asian countries. Obama is going to visit Malaysia and Philippines, 2 countries which are actively involved in this problem. And therefore, there is a certain kind of impression that the United States would like to create by way of a corrective thing.
Okay.
That is very important. And then vis-a-vis China, it is also important that United States engages the military on the Chinese side and works out the ground rules. And it is not missing any opportunity, in fact, for expanding the interaction.
And the third template, because we're running out of time.
Sorry?
The third template?
I know the next template is this, that ultimately the US strategy with regard to this problem, it's not party to the problem, but is to herd the region, rally the region behind its leadership, and then negotiate with China.
All right. So we've run out of time on this segment. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Thank you. Welcome back. We're discussing the heightened tensions between US and China in the South China Sea. Master Sibal, do you agree with Master Bhadrakumar that these tensions are being shaped by rising apprehensions about the growth of China's military power and its regional intentions and how they play out against US intentions and US power in the region?
Well, yes, of course. Now, from my point of view, whatever the legal aspects of these disputes, the fact that China is now pursuing some of the things that the other countries you said have been doing in terms of creating airstrips, etc., poses a very different challenge, because all those are small countries and they don't have 9 dash lines. They're not claiming 80% of South China Sea. But when China does, it is posing a very important strategic challenge to all the countries in the region, and of course United States, which is very much present in the region. Its Navy is present in the region. It has defense alliances with these countries. So to my mind, it's China that is exerting more and more its power in the region incrementally. And I think at the end of the day, the Americans will find it very difficult to meet this China's challenge, because China will not meet them head on. but will keep on provoking United States and others keep on expanding its military power in the region, creating facts on the ground.
Yep.
And then the United States, because China in the meantime will also be becoming stronger militarily, the United States will find it very difficult to confront China. So China's strategy is very risky because they're taking on the world's foremost military power, but United States doesn't have a stomach really to confront China.
Okay. Professor Kondapalli, so the issue is not really about freedom of the sea. There are larger sort of strategic considerations. Because if it was merely a question of freedom of movement in the South China Sea, how come freedom of the movement of ships there is affected only by Chinese activity and not by the claims of Malaysia, Vietnam or Philippines?
It's true that there is an element of freedom of navigation in it. If you remember 2009, Financial Times reported about INS Airawat incident where an Indian naval ship was passing through, and it was, there were calls from the neighborhood, mainly from, it was believed to be from Chinese, that they need to respect the Chinese territorial sea construct in the South China Sea. So there is a freedom of navigation principle involved, and India had taken that position in the Hanoi summit of the East Asian Summit and the other ASEAN-related meetings when Mrs. Praneeth Kaur made that statement about the freedom of navigation. So there is that issue involved, freedom of navigation. But I wanted to say that the whole issue is actually it's an issue of power transition in Asia and especially in the South China Sea. I think both the Chinese and US are trying to assert and reassert their claims.
Yeah.
The 5 reefs that China is building actually is about 20 times bigger than what, say, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia are all doing collectively. So this is strategic in nature. The reef construction is strategic in nature. Thirdly, I think when the Chinese imposed the ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone in East China Sea, about a couple of years ago, while the US had sent B-52 bombers, finally they acquiesced to the Chinese ADIZ. So this incident also indicates that the US resistance would be only pro forma for the Chubi Reef incident. I think they will have some kind of a tie-up with the Chinese as negotiations go on. As the US Pacific Commander is in Beijing, they will discuss these issues, and probably a G2 kind of situation will emerge in the South China Sea.
Okay. Ambassador Bhadrakumar, isn't the disputed area around Spratly Islands believed to be rich in oil and natural gas? So are we therefore seeing, I mean particularly around the Malaysian and the Vietnamese coast, so aren't we therefore seeing also a battle, conflicting claims for rights to exploit these natural resources there?
Naturally, this is wherever there is a tension of this sort, particularly in the nature of territorial disputes, but not necessarily there, even in regional conflicts, even in Syria, you can find gas. Even in Golan Heights, you can find gas. Eastern Mediterranean, you can find gas. So all these issues are,
But
definitely.
You're saying this is not a primary issue.
This is not the primary issue. As I mentioned, what has happened is, China's economic relationship with the Southeast Asian countries, even Australia, for instance, entire Australia's prosperity, if you really want to account for it, it's in terms of the Chinese market. So the Americans are being edged out, elbowed out. And the one way of getting in, Americans are pushing back at, this is what is happening. Yeah. And the dilemma there is this, that, that even for the European countries today, the economies are stagnant. Say, Angela Merkel has just undertaken her 8th visit in her 10 years as Chancellor to China. And they have already decided she is returning next year. So you see, for Germany, for instance, a very important, exports are very important for sustaining its prosperity and its economy.
So and you're saying Chinese bullying will be accepted by everybody?
No, the point is the United States is not going to be able to get the allies into it. Say, the way Britain received President Xi, for example, it clearly shows that it needs to fight this alone. This is the point.
Okay, but let me just keep to this freedom of navigation business a bit and let's understand it slightly better. Is the freedom of navigation being defended for all cargo ships, irrespective of their nationality, or only for military ships, whether they're US or Indian or some other countries?
No. You see, there is a bit of a problem because insofar as the extended economic zone is concerned, the Americans do not accept that there can be any restrictions on the freedom of military ships going through the extended economic zone, whereas other countries, including India, object to this, that we should be forewarned, we should be alerted about this. The Americans don't accept this. So this is different from the 12 nautical mile issue. In this case of the artificial islands, according to the reports I have read, this destroyer actually went within the 12-mile nautical zone.
That's because you're challenging territorial waters
Territorial
concept
waters.
Of artificial
So
islands.
therefore, to answer your question, insofar as the cargo ships are concerned, there is no restriction insofar as the extended economic zone is concerned. But there is a dispute, or there is the difference of views over the right of free passage of military vessels across the extended economic zone, and the United States asserts that right, but many countries don't accept that.
Okay, a quick answer from you, Professor Kondapalli. Does the US fear that the Chinese claims in the South China Sea would actually block its access to Western Pacific?
Actually, last 1 year, the United States conducted about 19 freedom of navigation operations. The Chinese are also doing the same. In Alaska, for instance, a month ago, the Pentagon said that it came very close to the 12 nautical mile limit, the Chinese ships, vessels.
No, my question was quickly, what is the concern here? That the US ships' access to Western Pacific will be blocked if China claims rights over the entire or most of South China Sea?
The 5 reefs that China is constructing, possibly these are meant for military installations and also the air bases, which is the speculation.
Okay.
Militarizing, although President Xi Jinping said that they are not militarizing the region, it indicates that China is planning to actually establish an ADIZ in South China Sea and a kind of anti-access area denial strategy in South China Sea, which means then that not just for the United States, even for India, 55% of Indian trade passes through South China Sea. So it's also a life and death situation for the Indian side. It's not just for the United States.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again with this discussion in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the face-off between US and China in the South China Sea. Master Bhadrakumar, how high are the prospects of an accidental military conflict between the US and China in the South China Sea? After all, there have been incidents in the past when these missions have been carried out. 2 Chinese aircraft collided, China and US aircraft collided in 2001, a surveillance aircraft of US and a fighter jet of China. US ships were harassed at close quarters, USS Impeccable and USNS Victorious in 2009. Chinese submarine crashed into a sonar being towed by a US destroyer again in 2009. So do you think Admiral Wu Shengli of China was right in saying that minor incident could spark a war?
See, one thing is this, that that any conflict situation, if it arises, will be only accidental. I don't think it's even President Obama's mind to go for a confrontation with China. Starting from the Paris summit meeting on climate change, a whole lot of the plate is very full.
They've said accidental.
No, that's fine. So it can only happen accidentally. Now that is where the two, and neither side is interested in that also. And they would like to eliminate that. And that is why they would like to have ground rules in terms of this. But having said that, this is not the last time this is happening. This will happen because pride and prejudice and everything is involved in it. It's a very, very combustible crucible. And so long as it's quite established as to what kind of a stakeholder China will be in the international system, and the United States learns to live with it, I think this will go on.
Okay. Professor Kondapalli, so US and China may not get into direct conflict if we are to believe Mr. Bhadrakumar. But could the US get drawn into a conflict between China and the Philippines over natural gas deposits because of the Mutual Defense Treaty? So if China attacks Philippines, wouldn't the US be obliged to go to their defense?
Well, the treaty doesn't say about this. Most of the treaties that the United States had cobbled up with South Korea, with Japan, with other countries, it provides for some flexibility in terms of final decision by the White House. So there is that ambiguity in all the treaties that United States actually had with its allies. And this came up in Senkaku Islands issue. This came up in South Korea, North Korea related issues. So there is that flexibility that US could decide on. But I think the issue there is, of course, China will lose face if it has to confront Philippines or Vietnam. Within the ASEAN, it will lose its face, and it will have a larger impact in terms of soft power and so on and so forth.
But Sibal, how has India got drawn into the South China Sea disputes? While drilling for oil and gas and exploring for oil and gas with Vietnam. So, if there is if something triggers an armed clash between China and Vietnam, what would be India's position?
Well, we were involved in Vietnam long before these issues came up, and all these claims were made in South China Sea. So, therefore, we shouldn't link our presence offshore in Vietnam to the disputes that are occurring today, number one. Number two, if there is a clash between China and Vietnam, there's nothing much we can do. We'll probably have to stop drilling until the conflict is over. But I would conclude by saying, from my point of view, that China cannot risk a war with the United States because they are not in a position to fight the United States. And not only will they lose face in...
But he's saying they're not in a position to even risk a war with Vietnam and Philippines.
Because of the United States factor. That is true, and other considerations which he mentioned, which are right. The views that the ASEAN countries will take, as it is, some of these countries are becoming vocal. Even Malaysia has reacted sharply to what has happened in the Subi Reef case. So I think that China is playing, to my mind, dangerous games, and one hopes that it doesn't result in any unexpected and unwished for military conflict in this region.
Last question to you, Ambassador Bhadrakumar. Is India expected to be on the same page as US in ensuring freedom of navigation of military patrols in South China Sea? And does our signing a joint strategic vision for Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean have any impact on this? Because if you look at that joint vision, it says, we affirm the importance of safeguarding maritime security and ensuring freedom of navigation and overflights throughout the region, especially in the South China Sea.
You see, this is a far more profound question than about South China Sea. I personally believe that from the behavioral patterns of major allies of the United States and Europe, traditional allies like Germany, France, Britain particularly, with regard to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, they ignored the American protestations. So I have always held the belief that we have specific problems with China, and geography dictates that we'll have to live side by side, and China's rise is inexorable, and therefore we cannot handle the relationship with China within the matrix of the United States' regional strategy. There has to be an independent policy. So we tap into it to the extent that is necessary for us to draw energy out of it, positive energy for us, but not as a pillion rider.
All right. I'd like both of you to quickly also comment on this, that India's this joint strategic vision with US and specific provisions there that we support the US in South China Sea. That's what it means to me. What does it mean? Are we on the same page? Are we expected to be on the same page?
I think we should have three options. One is to have independently freedom of navigation operations, naval operations in South China Sea. We have been conducting this before with Vietnam, with other ASEAN countries, Singapore, and so on. So one is independently conducting along with these countries. Second is also to join US and Japan. We just finished the trilateral recently.
And third?
Third is to also approach China in terms of the joint maritime cooperation.
So quickly, sir, we've really run out of time.
I think we have this joint vision statement which outlines a strategic convergence linking the security of South China Sea or the Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So that has its own logic. But we can't put all our eggs in the US basket because there are uncertainties about the US commitment, desire,
You're saying that
capacity.
the joint vision is not binding?
It's a joint vision. It's binding. It's not binding, legally binding, but we can try and build convergences around it. But it will not be in our interest to actually tie ourselves to the US strategy. I agree we should have an independent strategy, but we should make the maximum out of the US desire and willingness to confront China, because the kind of danger that China poses will affect our interests also.
Okay, on that note, we've really run out of time. I'd like to thank all of you. Ambassador Bhadrakumar, Professor Srikant Kondapalli, Ambassador Kanwal Sibal for participating in this discussion. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.